Hey guys, I got a little bit of a video today. This was one that really freaking annoys me and I had to go off on it. There was this guy that was on Tim Pool's live show recently and he was talking about reparations again. Look, I'm gonna be completely honest. This ticks me off for so many reasons because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Okay, look, I'm gonna start with me, alright, with my example. My family can trace its history back to the Civil War, okay? My ancestor was a Northern Democrat. He fought for the Union to preserve the Union, okay? By that logic, my ancestors helped free the slaves. My ancestors didn't own slaves. They didn't enforce slavery. They fought against it. And it's very possible that many parts of my family actually opposed slavery since they were Northern Democrats, Frenchmen, who originally lived in Canada, or what would be owned by Canada, which was eventually taken over by the United States. Okay? The Democrats will never give you reparations because, look, listen, if we were going by blood libel that the people who were enslaved have to get money from everybody else who benefited from slavery. If you're talking about that, why don't I go back in my history, okay? If you can prove that the entire 13% of Americans who are black were slaves at some point, which is not the case. That is not the case. They have to prove, when California brought this up, they would have to prove that their ancestors were slaves. So they want to get reparations for having been slaves. Well, why do I have to pay those reparations when my ancestors freed the slaves? It doesn't make any damn sense. And a lot of people are not just pure Southerner. A lot of people have Northern ancestry, which means that their families helped free the slaves. Or there are people whose families weren't even in America until after the Civil War. So why would they have to pay reparations? So let's be fair here. If you're going to pay reparations, the 87% of the country who is not black would be paying the last 13% reparations. If you were to go honestly, you would say 100% would be paying whatever percent of the black population was enslaved at some point in their family history. And this doesn't count all the people that are mixed race. What happens if you're half white? What happens if you're like Joy Reid? Because if you didn't know, Joy Reid had her ancestry read not too long ago. And turns out her white ancestors owned slaves. And I think it turned out that her black ancestors weren't slaves to begin with. So when does Joy Reid pay reparations? Why wouldn't she be taxed? Why would she get reparation money? It doesn't make any damn sense. And furthermore, Democrats will never give it to you. They will never give reparations. Do you know why? Because you'd be taxing either 100% of the country, or even worse, maybe you're taxing 87% of the country to give to the remaining 13%, whether or not they were slaves or not, whether or not their ancestors were slaves or not. Do you know what would happen if you did that? If you taxed 87% of the population to pay off black people, to give black people money, without them having to prove that their ancestors were slaves, you would ensure that Republicans would never lose ever again. Republicans would win every election. They would sweep every goddamn election. It would become a one-party country. The Democrats would cease to exist. They would piss off so many people if they gave out reparations. They will never do it. Even if they had the votes to do it, which they have had the votes to do it before, but they won't do it. Do you want to know why? Because they would be pissing off the majority of the country for a minority. Guess what happens? The majority of the country would never vote for Democrats ever again if you decided to tax them hundreds upon thousands upon tens of thousands of dollars to give millions of dollars to people whose ancestors were slaves. It's too late. It's never going to happen. I never owned slaves, and freaking my family never owned slaves, but you want me to pay people who were never enslaved. Look, Detroit had a huge problem back in the day. Northern Democrats, including my ancestor, made a mistake. Now, I don't know how involved my ancestor personally was in it, but back in the day, they would say that Republicans were racist because they wanted everyone to become American, which means that eventually they would give up their own country's culture and traditions and replace it with American traditions. They would become American. It was called the melting pot theory. Whereas for Democrats, they believed in the tossed salad theory, which means everyone should keep their own traditions. They would live with their friends and family. They would live with people from their own country. They could keep all their traditions, and they would never integrate. Well, guess what that happened? That would mean you would have a Polish community, you would have an Islamic community, you would have a black community, you would have a Hispanic community, and like they would speak their own languages. You would have like a Chinese community. They would speak their own languages, keep their own traditions. They would never marry outside their own race, which means that these little places eventually became ghettos for all the minorities. And people forget how like discriminated against the Irish were and the Italians were, because a lot of the Irish were associated or were falsely associated with the Irish mob, whereas the Italians were associated, falsely or not, with the Italian mafia. So they would be ghettos too. In fact, a lot of the Irish were basically treated like indentured servants, which is barely a step above being a slave. So why don't the Irish get reparations if they had to basically be enslaved for 20 years? And a lot of them may even die in the process so that they wouldn't have to be provided a plot of land by whoever had indentured them in the first place. Because that's what would happen. Once their indentured servitude ended, they'd be given a plot of land. So a lot of these like plantation owners would work their Irish indentured servants to death or not take care of their health to allow them to die so they wouldn't have to be paid off. So a lot of these people were either dead or crippled by the time that they actually finished with their indentured servitude. Why don't they get reparations? My family is also Irish, and English, and French, and German, and Hungarian, and Flemish. Like, there were times in my family's histories where they were probably enslaved in Hungary, or in the area that would become Hungary. But I don't get reparations from Europe, now do I? So why should I pay for reparations when it's provable that my ancestors helped free the slaves to begin with? And you could say, oh, but you benefited from slavery. Did I? Did my ancestors benefit from slavery? How do you know where they bought their cotton? How do you know they even used cotton clothing? A lot of these people used hemp or like silk or like other types of materials. I mean, for the love of God, it doesn't make any damn sense. Linen, whatever the hell. Wool. Not everyone used cotton. Wool clothing was actually more well used, especially in like military uniforms, that my ancestors wore to free the slaves. Just, oh my God, it ticks me off so much anytime I hear someone ignorantly say that Democrats are going to give you reparations. No, they won't. But let's get back to the tossed salad theory, okay? In the North, what happened is you had all these little ghettos that basically were made out of minorities, and these could be Catholic ghettos too, like the Irish, the Polish, the Hungarians. They could be Catholic, which you would consider them white, and they were in their own little ghettos too. Well, at some point, they decided to integrate the schools. And my mom pointed out the actual reason why this was so controversial. It wasn't that people were upset that they were being integrated. A lot of people didn't care about race. What the problem was is that they enforced students to go to specific schools. So they could say, like, okay, these people in this neighborhood, they would go house to house. Okay, you have 2 kids. Your 2 kids are going to go all the way to the other side of Detroit. They'll go to the next house. Okay, you have a kid. Your kid's going to go to the local school. They would go to the next house. Okay, your 3 kids are going to go to this school that on the other side of town. And they basically just randomly assign these kids to random schools inside of Detroit, which means that your kid would be bused to a school that was like an hour away every single day, regardless of where your job was. So your kid, like, let's say your kid was sent to the far side of Detroit and your job was in the other direction. That would mean that in a time before cell phones, you would be an hour and a half away from your kid. If you didn't want the bus to pick up your kid, you would have to drive an hour and a half to go pick up your own kid, because the city told you your kid had to go to some random ass school on the other side of town. Or they would be waiting at the bus stop by themselves in a neighborhood that wasn't that safe, because they were being sent to some ghetto in some far distant point of Detroit where the education system might not have been as good. Now granted, a lot of these ghettos had the best teachers. It just so happens that they also had the worst students. So you would still have a bad time actually trying to like teach these kids anything, because these teachers would become experts at dealing with problem students. The problem is that the students were still problematic and would still cause issues and get themselves expelled or suspended or join a gang or something like that. So these kids, like these white kids, would be sent to a neighborhood where a lot of the black folk there blamed them and their families for all the problems that had happened to their community. Even if they were Irish, even if they were Hungarian, even if they were equally discriminated against by the system. Because again, Catholics, especially Irish Catholics and Hungarian Catholics and Polish Catholics, were not treated very well by the Protestant white leadership. They were all in their own little ghettos as well. I'm sorry, like the camera keeps moving on me. But then, like these black communities would blame all white people for their problems, and it could actually be dangerous to send your kid to those schools. But the main problem my mom pointed out is that it was waiting at the bus stop for like an hour in an unknown neighborhood, where it would take your parents an hour and a half to come get you. Like, let's say a bus, for whatever reason, didn't stop at your bus stop, or like couldn't pick you up, or like the bus driver called out sick and they couldn't get a replacement. How the hell, after school hours, when like all the teachers are gone home and the school is locked and like the student is just waiting at a bus stop for a bus that's never going to come, is the parent going to figure out that they need to go pick up their pick up their child, I mean, because cell phones didn't exist. Would they have to use a payphone? Would they even know how to use one? It just caused so many problems. that's when a lot of these parents decided, you know what? I'm just going to go to the suburbs where I can pick and choose where my student goes to school, so I'm actually within driving distance of them in case of emergency, in case I have to pick them up, in case the teacher calls and says, hey, your kid just threw up in the middle of class. Because if they threw up in the middle of class, obviously you would have to go pick them up. And it would take you an hour and a half to drive to the school to pick them up, and then drive another hour home to drop them off at home, and then another half hour to get back to work. At that point, you might as well just cut out. You might as well just say, hey boss, I'm going home and I'm not coming back. And when you're not coming back, you're not being paid money to pay for your kids' like college, to pay for your kids' food, to pay for anything. It's not even like the neighborhoods. Maybe the neighborhoods that the kid was being sent to wasn't even necessarily dangerous. Maybe it's just that, hey, if there was an issue, it would take 2 hours of driving to fix it. It's just... And then you would lose out an entire day of work. Like, these are poor communities. These were poor communities. So, like, these parents just said, you know what? Screw it. We're leaving so that we can be within 2 miles of where our kid goes to school, or whatever the hell. We're just going to send our student to a school that's nearby instead of halfway across town. Because that makes sense. Because let's say you worked in downtown Detroit, and instead you lived in like Grosse Pointe, or your kid's in Grosse Pointe. If you work downtown Detroit, you're only half an hour away from your student, as opposed to, like, say you live in Mexico Town. Yeah, there is a Mexican town in Detroit. But say you lived in Mexico Town, and now suddenly you have to go all the way to Hamtramck to pick up your student, and then drive all the way back to Mexico Town. You know how much of a pain in the ass that would be? If you don't know the distance between those two cities, look it up. It's literally on the other side of the county. So if you could pick up your stuff, sell your home, and leave, you would. Anyone would. And a huge problem is, after, like, the Great Society, which I believe was LBJ, he would give, like, tax credits and benefits to single black mothers. Single women, technically, who were parents, single parents, but this would often be specifically to black people because they wanted to break up black families. They wanted black men to be deadbeats, and they encouraged this behavior. Whereas a lot of white families had two sources of income. Twice the amount of money without having to use benefits, twice the income. They had enough money to leave, whereas the benefits provided by the Great Society was meant to barely sustain yourself on. But it would encourage black families to not form. That father could just cut and run and just leave his kid behind, and it would be completely fine because, again, the courts often benefited the mothers who would get custody of the child, but the mother was also encouraged to work because of feminism. So they couldn't actually raise their kid. They couldn't barely afford a babysitter. They would have to leave their kids with, like, their uncle or their father or something like that, or their mother, because then at some point it became a generational thing where black fathers became deadbeats and left their kids behind. So you would have a grandmother, but you would have no idea who your father or your grandfather was, because, again, these benefits mostly went to black people to encourage them to not settle down and have successful marriages. And then they would become reliant on the government, and because this was a Democrat policy, these black people would then vote for Democrats forever, which is why LBJ was specifically noted as saying, I'm going to have these N-words, vote Democrat forever. This is what they wanted. And it was busing that caused this issue. Now, Joe Biden also opposed busing, but he opposed it because he was just a racist. A lot of people didn't oppose it because of racism. They did it because of convenience. They didn't want to have to drive all the way across town to pick up their kid. It just made more sense that they could pick their own house, pick the school that their kid went to, and then pick what job they wanted. Apply to a job that was nearby instead of the city just arbitrarily changing where your kid went to school. And they could change it at any given time. They're like, oh, okay, we're going to switch him to this school because we think it'll be a better fit for him. It's like, no, I just got a job near that school. Well, too bad. Now he's on this school, which is an hour and a half away from your place of work. It's like, nope, not having the government tell me where I have to send my kids to school. Because now I'm going to have to quit my job to find a job that's near that school. And a lot of parents just couldn't do that. Especially if they didn't have, a car. Because maybe they also took the bus. Or maybe they walked to work. Maybe they didn't have a car. But they could they could sell their home and, get a U-Haul, or whatever the equivalent back in the 70s or 60s was. And just move their stuff to a new house. And yeah, the taxes might be more expensive, but then they could walk to a new house. They could walk to work. They could walk their kid to school. Their kid could walk home from school without having to wait hours for a bus to show up. I saw people go to catechism after school, where they just had to wait 2 hours, 3 hours for their parents to get off work so they can come pick them up. And not every school provides that service, because that service is mainly for the Catholic school that I went to, or Catholic schools in general. Because we didn't really have a busing system as far as I'm aware. But I was always close enough I could just walk home. And I had my key. And my neighborhood was safe. Now, it was perfectly fine to walk home. But what happens if you're, forced, if they want you to walk home, even if they sent you to a school that was nearby? What happens if your neighborhood was a huge drug den? Or, people were being robbed all the time? You think the parents were as comfortable with, with their kids walking home in those kinds of conditions? Hell no. Which is why a thing called white flight started. Again, because the Great Society made it so black families were too poor, because they didn't have a father in the house, to move. They didn't have the funding to leave. Especially if the city of Detroit was offering its own type of, money. Maybe Detroit was giving these families money, these single mothers money. So you couldn't move to the suburbs because the suburbs weren't providing the same service, because they just didn't have enough tax revenue coming in. Because all the tax revenue usually went to the schools. Or because the suburbs weren't pants on head retarded and trying to give free gifts to everybody. It doesn't make any sense, man. Reparations doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense under any stretch of the imagination. Stop asking for it. It's never going to happen, and if it did happen, it would just take off the majority of the country and ensure Democrats would never win. So you know for a fact that Democrats would never do it, ever. Because if they succeeded, they would lose the majority of their support. That's just a fact. It's just a fact. Anyways, I ranted on for 25 minutes about this. I cannot stress this enough. A lot of people didn't want to move to the suburbs because they were racist and didn't like black people. They just didn't want their kids to be halfway across town. It just didn't make any sense for that. From a logistical standpoint, from a convenience standpoint, from just like a pure like, I don't want my kid to be separated from me by that distance for that long in a neighborhood that I don't know. Because maybe the neighborhood is fine. Maybe it is okay, but you don't know that. You don't know. What are you going to do? You're going to go down to that neighborhood and check in with every house and like, hey, if any of your kids part of a gang? I mean, you can just check around the neighborhood, see like how dilapidated it was. But a lot of the ghettos weren't as dilapidated back then, so it was harder to tell. I go through a lot of neighborhoods that look like the suburbs, but you can kind of tell that like the houses are slightly more run down, just slightly. There's slightly more trash around, but only slightly. But then you look up like the voting demographics, see like how that neighborhood votes, and you find out that they vote for like 80% Democrat. And so you're like, oh, okay, so a lot of people in this neighborhood are actually racist, and they actually hate, like, they actually like want high taxes, and they also like they probably don't have leaders who want to have good policing in the area or something like that. Because let's face it, the Democrats are the party of the criminals at this point, okay? Oh my god, I could talk about this all goddamn day. But again, with Joe Biden, he opposed busing, integrated schools, not because of any of that, no. He specifically said that he didn't want his kids growing up in a racial jungle because he thought that all the races mixing together would cause so much chaos and endanger his kids. Because he was a racist. He can make arguments about it, but I certainly don't agree with that stance. I went to a mixed race school and it wasn't that much of a problem. Wasn't that much of a problem. There were some issues here or there, but I mean, it is what it is. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there because I can just go in circles on this forever. That's it for now, guys. Bye.